Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's Bobby, and we are back talking about a couple cameras that have quite surprised the market in a little bit of a way. Now, we thought the point-and-shoot camera market was pretty much done, right? We thought, okay, smartphones are going to take over. That's it. Point-and-shoots are going to go bye-bye. We'll have APS-C, we'll have full frame, we'll have medium format. But then Sony and Canon decided to surprise all of us a few weeks back with, of course, the RX100 Mark VII and the G5X and G7X Mark III and Mark II, respectively. Now, 2 out of the 3 have microphone jacks, good sound quality. 1 doesn't. Not gonna tell you which camera that is, the one I'm filming on right now. But anyway, there's a lot of videos out there talking about the video quality on these cameras. You know, it's all about vlogging these days, which is the best. I'm watching all these YouTube videos and they're all saying the same thing. So we thought to ourselves here, now we're not gonna do that. We're not gonna do another review talking about the same thing everybody else is talking about because we already know. So we thought, why not we talk about photography for a moment and talk about how these cameras perform photography-wise, you know? Because that's where it's gonna be a little bit more similar. Differences, of course, but we thought, we're not gonna talk about video. Everyone does video nowadays. And I might not even be in focus at this point in time, but we're gonna talk about the photo quality of these cameras because they still take photos. And that's where things get very interesting. We've got image quality, we've got aperture, we've got shutter speed, we've got lens, zoom length, we've got color profiles, color science. It's gonna be very interesting. So here's our thoughts between the G5X Mark II and the Sony RX100 Mark VII. Now, I do want to say that we are not paid by Canon or Sony for this review. These are our thoughts and our thoughts only. So first, let's talk about build quality and design. First, talking about build quality and design, you're going to notice that the Sony and the Canon look really similar looking from the top down on the cameras. But that's where it really ends. When you look at the Canon G5X Mark II, it's more of a photographer's camera. It's a little bit longer, has a little bit more weight to it, and you got this nice grip here that feels really good in the hand now. It has this kind of like faux leather wrap around it, and I really enjoy holding this. Now, the Sony, on the other hand, is a much more compact camera, shorter than the Canon, and you really got to sort of cradle your hand around, for the most part. If you want to get up there and take a picture, it's not bad, but I feel like I prefer the Canon much more. Now, in terms of build quality, both of these are very robust feeling cameras, but the Canon once again screams better build quality to me. I don't know what material they're using, what if it's different, or if it's just the texture, or what's the overall weight, but it just feels a lot more robust. If I drop this, I feel like I'm not gonna break it the first time out, as were the Sony. It does feel really good, but because the screen is right there, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it is similar in a lot of ways, but something about this camera makes me feel a little bit less secure about the drop damage versus the Canon. In terms of displays, now both of these displays you can actually flip up, as you can see on the Canon and the Sony. Now, the Canon is a much larger display. I like that, especially if you're doing any sort of selfie photography or anything else like that, or even viewing your photos on the back of it, it's a lot easier to see the pictures. The Sony's is much smaller, but again, it's a smaller camera. It's not a deal breaker, but it's something that you'll notice if you put the cameras next to each other. Now, both of these cameras also have a viewfinder on them, and they're EVFs, by the way, but they're different in how they, in terms of the work. Now, the Canon is a two-step process. As you can see, pop up there, pull out. Now, that's reminiscent of the older RX100s. But as you can tell, the camera doesn't turn on. Now, with the Sony, the camera turns on automatically and the viewfinder automatically pops out for you to use. And then when you push it back down, the camera turns off. Now, the Sony, by and large, works better, but I will say that the Canon has a much larger EVF, and it's very noticeable when you're using it. So if you are taking pictures with it, it will be a much more easier and pleasant experience versus the Sony. Now, let's talk about what's inside of these cameras. Now, we've got the 20.1 megapixel 1-inch sensor on these. These are backside illuminated sensors, I believe. And of course, you've got the Sony processor. I think it's the Bion ZX processor to it. The Canon got the Digigate processor. So these are really powerful point-and-shoot cameras. Now, Sony's basically saying that the RX100 is a mini A9 for all intents and purposes, and that's because, of course, the eye tracking, the no blackout 20 frames per second burst rate in terms of shooting, you know, it's just a very fast, formidable camera. Canon is not touting that at all with the G5X Mark II. There is no dual pixel autofocus. Now, a lot of people have been talking about this in terms of video, but in terms of photo, this also makes a big difference because dual pixel autofocus for Canon is one of their, I would say, main features a lot of people love to go to Canon for. And the fact that they didn't put it in this G5X Mark II is a little bit disappointing. There is a difference, and you're going to see it right away when you use both of these cameras. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not going to get good photos out of the Canon. You will. It just means you have to sort of be a little bit more patient. Sometimes you're going to have to, it'll hunt a little bit more for focusing, but you still can get beautiful photos out of it. The Sony is just very quick. If you want something that is just your confidence inspired, you know you're going to get the shot, especially if you're shooting people with eye tracking, especially with animals or people, the Sony's where you want to be at. Now, let's talk about lenses, because this is where it gets a little bit interesting. The Sony, and they've done this a couple times with the RX100 Mark VI and now with the 7, is they've gone for a slower aperture, 2.8 to 4.5, 24 to 200 millimeter. Now, this is a little more like an all-purpose type of focal zoom lens. But again, you're not getting that shallow depth of field. It's not going to be great for low light. You're going to really have to push up the ISO. Now, Canon has done something that I really applaud them for on this camera. They've given you a 1.8 to 2.8 on the aperture, 24 to 100. Now, it is expandable if you want to go into digital zoom, but that's a much more reasonable focal length for a lot of people. 200 is a little bit long for a point and shoot. It's kind of nice if you really want to reach out there if you're traveling somewhere and you want to capture a person or a building and you can't get there by walking or getting a little bit closer. But for the most part, this is where a lot of people are really happy with, and I've heard a lot of conversations out there on the web, and myself included, that they wish that Sony would have put a focal length like that on the RX100 Mark VII, especially because these cameras are much more for just daily travel and, you know, shooting people up close or plants or animals up close. You really don't need 200 millimeters in my personal opinion. Also, this has a built-in ND filter inside of the camera. That means you can shoot 1.8 without having to really push up the shutter speed so much. That means you get a nicer image quality out of this thing. You're not really pushing the camera to its extremes. Whereas this, you're 2.8 to 4.5. It's okay, but it's nice to have a nice little depth of field and be able to shoot lower light with this. This is where the Canon really excels over the Sony. And especially if you're into photography, knife shots, you're going to appreciate the Canon a little bit more. Now, the Sony does 20 frames per second, zero blackout. That is very reminiscent of the A9, and that's why they call it the Mini A9. And they also does like a 90 frames per second, like I think it's like 2 shots or something like that. It's something absurd. We tried it out when we were demoing the RX100 Mark VII. I've got a picture of it I'll put up here that shows me popping a bubble, or someone popping a bubble with their finger. I'm just capturing that moment. I wouldn't say it's a gimmick, but it's not something you're going to use every day for 90 frames per second. But the 20 frames per second is going to be great, especially if you want to shoot your kids playing soccer or football or any sort of sports, or maybe your dog running in the park, or something very fast action, and you don't want to carry a big camera around. The Sony's got you covered. Now, the Canon also does 20 frames per second and also does 30 frames per second in raw burst mode. So it is still a very formidable camera, but I do have to give it to the Sony, of course, because I just feel more confident getting those fast action shots with the Sony versus the Canon. Not to say it won't do it, but the Sony, I feel, does it a little bit better. But anyway, enough about me talking about the performance of these cameras. Let's go into Lightroom. Let's take a look at images up close to see the differences and see which camera is right for you. Now we're looking at images shot with the RX100 Mark VII and the G5X Mark II. These images were shot in RAW, imported into Lightroom. No editing has been done to these images whatsoever. Now, one of the examples we're going to show is skin tones, because this has always been a hot topic of discussion between Sony and Canon, and you're going to see the difference right here. Okay, this is the RX100 Mark VII. As you can tell, right out of camera, RAW, I have like a reddish skin tone to my face. It almost looks slightly sunburned. This is the same image out of the Canon. Much more neutralized. Actually, the image is a little bit sharper too, and this is at 1.8 versus 2.8. And this is a better starting point for me as someone who wants to possibly edit the photo from RAW, because this is more neutralized, whereas the Sony, I now have to take down the red, take down some of the orange hue. I really got to work on the skin tone image to get it to where I want it to be, versus the Canon right out of camera. This is a much better image to start with. Now let's look at a cityscape here. This is with the Sony RX100 Mark VII. Now again, we're getting a little bit more of that orange reddish hue that's in the images. This is at sunset, but I'm going to show you that same image with the Canon. As you can tell, a little bit more neutralized, but when you're looking at the detail, it's relatively the same. Now, if I want to be a pixel peeper, I would say that maybe the Sony is slightly sharper here. This could be a bit of handshake. It could be the lens, but I would say overall though, the color tones, I much prefer out of the Canon versus the Sony. Now, here's another picture of this little girl who's standing on this basket overlooking the sunset. Now, one thing I noticed right here is that there is some flare coming into the lens on the Canon. Now we have a similar image with the Sony. Again, she stepped off the basket right away, so it was a little bit hard to sort of get the same exact image, but you could pretty much tell. The skin tone, the color cast is very different out of the Sony versus the Canon. Much more orangish, reddish hues to it. Again, I have to put more work in this to edit it where I want to be, but I don't see any flaring out of the lens with the Sony versus the Canon. Now we'll talk about zoom for a second here, because this is where a big difference is between both of the cameras. The Canon obviously doesn't have the longer zoom out of the two, but you can see it retains a lot of great detail, and this is pretty color accurate to what I was seeing out that day. Now let's look at the Sony. This, of course, the Sony goes double the length in terms of zoom, but it holds a lot of detail here. So I gotta give it to Sony. They've done a great job with their 200mm zoom lens versus the Canon's, which is around 100 plus. So this color cast here, work needs to be done, but I gotta hand it to Sony. The image looks quite sharp for being this zoomed in. And last but not least, we are going to look at this flower here. This is out of the RX100 Mark VII. Now, this obviously you can tell quite saturated out of camera. This could be something that's done with the processing of the image right from Sony, but as you can tell, it's a bit more reddish than I actually saw. Pretty good detail though, can't complain about that. But taking a look at the Canon here, this is a much more neutralized color, and I would say slightly more detail on the flower versus the Sony. And then last but not least, let's talk about depth of field, because of course the Canon can, it starts at 1.8 to 2.8. The Sony is obviously not as fast of a lens, and you get great shallow depth of field when you're going up close, get some nice separation, fall off there. The Canon does a really good job, and that's why I prefer it over the Sony for image quality. Now, talking about displays for a moment, there's one big thing we need to talk about, and I've got to applaud Canon on this, is that they've enabled full touch control with the display. And that means going through the menu, through, you know, of course, got touch focusing and everything else, but going through the menu, just accessing things is so much easier on the G5X Mark II versus the Sony. I wish Sony, and this is funny to me because I don't know why, and they don't even do this on their Alpha series as well. These screens are touch enabled. Why does Sony not allow us to have a menu that is touch enabled on their cameras? Why? I have no idea. Now, as you can tell in this review, we didn't talk a lot about the video specs that these cameras have, and because that's not what this review is about. There's plenty of videos out there that talk about all the functionality and the feature sets that the Sony has over the Canons, and I'm not going to beat a dead horse with it. The Sony is a much better video camera than the Canon is G5X or G7X, okay? But in terms of photography, now that's where it's different. Now, looking at the images of Lightroom, I mean, the Canon has a beautiful color to it. That Canon colors, you can say it's BS or not. I see it in the images. They look really good, but the Sonys do as well. But the one thing that stood out for me, of course, was that 1.8. It allows me to have lower light shots, a nicer depth of field to it. I like that focal range a lot more, that 24 to 100 versus the 24 to 200. I don't need 200 millimeters on a point and shoot camera. You might, but I don't. Anyway, from a photography standpoint, image quality wise, I'm gonna give it to the Canon. But I have to say this, the Canon takes a little bit more work to get the shots because of the autofocusing. The Sony, this is the best point and shoot camera hybrid I've ever used. If you want a hybrid, you want to do 4K video, you want to do vlogging, you want to have great photos, but great video, this is your camera. If you just want to get into photography and you're like, look, I really don't care about video, at the price point, the Canon is the better buy with really good image quality. Anyway, those are my thoughts on these two cameras. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, subscribe to us on YouTube. Until the next one, take care.